In 1865, Ben Hogan, an accomplished prize-fighter and rogue, came to Pit Hole, the famous early oil boomtown in Venango County, where he soon began a career as the gentleman from hell and the wickedest man in the world. For years he moved with the tide of the oil excitement, and his saloons and gambling dens provided entertainment for the men at the end of each grimy day. There are dozens of stories about the man, but surely the most famous is this one. When Ben Hogan appeared at Parker's Ferry, a 100-barrel-a-day well had just recently turned the sleepy settlement into a miniature pit hole, and people had begun to call the place Parker City. Hogan knew a good thing when he saw it and took steps to set up shop, but was opposed by the local reform element, especially one Amory Frost, who owned building lots in the town and was very determined to keep out all dives. At Frost's order, nobody in Parker dared to rent Hogan either a lot or a building. But Hogan was not so easily beaten. One morning, Frost drove out to inspect some of his oil properties up the river, and when he returned at nightfall, his choicest building lot had sprouted a new board shanty containing a bar. Hogan heard Frost's howl of outrage and met him at the door. He shoved $100 into Frost's hand and an enormous fist under his nose. "You're my landlord now. I'll see you again a month from today. You'll find me prompt with the rent and prompter with my fist if anyone tries to make trouble. Now, if you'll step aside, there are customers anxious to get in." Hogan's daring gamble changed the tone of Parker City, and through the early spring of 1870 a dozen saloons moved into the growing town. But Amory Frost was a long way from being beaten. Through the winter he tried a half-dozen sly harassments that came to nothing, but by the following spring he thought he had the answer: a county liquor license bill to be passed with great secrecy. The night it became a law, Frost planned to personally lead a squad of deputies to arrest Ben Hogan for operating without a license. Hogan only chuckled at the news and went on about his business, curiously unworried, though it was noticed that he was making frequent trips to Pittsburgh on some mysterious business. The night of the raid finally came, and Ben's saloon was jammed as usual in the early evening, but when Frost and his deputies closed in 2 hours later, the shack was stripped and empty. They were still raging around in baffled fury when the sound of music and drunken revelry burst out from the river. And a moment later lights blazed out across the water from a river steamer anchored in midstream. A silk banner floating on the night breeze bore the words, "Ben Hogan's Floating Palace." Hogan's voice boomed out at the startled town through a huge megaphone. "Come one, come all, to Ben Hogan's Floating Palace of Pleasure, the only one of its kind in the world. Come play our games of chance, meet our 20 lovely ladies, dance to the finest orchestra in the country. Free champagne and whiskey for every visitor tonight. The boats will pick up guests at the landing every 10 minutes. Hurry out and have some fun." Hogan had quietly bought an old steamer hulk, 125 feet long, and had it remodeled and stocked and towed into position after dark that night to frustrate his enemy. It became the most famous resort in the oil regions and was written up by newspapers across the country. The more Hogan prospered, the more Amory Frost writhed and plotted vengeance. Shortly after the floating palace opened, Frost rode out one morning with the sheriff of Armstrong County and said, "You're running a saloon out here, and you still haven't bought a license. Arrest him, Sheriff." Ben leaned on the rail and yawned. "Are you gents collecting license fees for Clarion County these days?" The sheriff threw a startled look at landmarks along the river and swore bitterly. "We might as well go home, Mr. Frost. This boat is anchored right across the county line. The bow is in Armstrong County, right enough, but the stern, where his bar is located, is well on the Clarion County side." Frost stormed over to demand that the Clarion sheriff cooperate in a joint raid from both shores. He learned then what Hogan had already found out. The two sheriffs were bitter enemies who would never cooperate on anything. The idea of catching Ben by a raid was abandoned. All Hogan had to do was pull his boat to one side of the line or the other and thumb his nose at the law. Frost retired, but then hired every lawyer in Armstrong County to dig up old forgotten laws that Hogan was unwittingly breaking. When the traveling judge arrived in a few days for the fall term of circuit court, Hogan was to be arrested and charged with everything they could find. Soon enough, though, Hogan heard of the plan, and his eyes glittered with the birth of an idea. The day before court convened, he walked in on a meeting of Frost and the lawyers. "Boys," he said earnestly, "I know you're out to get me, and there's little I can do about it, but I don't think it's fair to condemn my place without ever seeing what goes on there. I'm inviting you all for a visit as my guests. Maybe you'll find new things to twist around and use against me, or maybe you'll see I'm not as bad as I'm painted." The chance to actually see the sin spot at first hand was irresistible, and the crowd was rowed to the floating palace. Ben was the most genial of hosts. Fine whiskies and imported champagne flowed like water, and the girls saw to it that no man's glass was empty. By nightfall they were all roaring drunk, and Amory Frost is said to have been quarreling with one of his lawyers over one of the girls. The night passed away, and when the sick and hungover pack straggled out on deck the following morning, they goggled in horror at an unfamiliar landscape. The palace, with anchors up, was drifting gently through a wilderness of towering hills and trackless forest. Ben met their howls of anguish with bland regret. "I feel terrible about this, gentlemen, but sometime in the night some scoundrel lifted both our anchors. We're halfway to Pittsburgh, and since the palace has no engines, there's no way to turn back." One of the lawyers wailed, "God almighty! Court convenes at 10 this morning. If we aren't there, we'll all be disbarred." Ben finally loaded them into a leaky skiff and sent them ashore to start the long hike back to Parker. He leaned over the rail with his thumb to his nose for a parting salute. "Have a nice walk. If the bears and wolves don't get you, I'd say you could be back explaining to the judge by midnight tomorrow night." And then Hogan merrily floated away to Pittsburgh, already hatching his next scheme. He would later return to Clarion County, where he would build yet another free and easy in Elk City, the last oil boom town in the county. Only many years later would he find religion and begin to tell his story to his biographer, George Trainer.